In the very soul of San Francisco, where the Pacific fog coils inward, a vaporous, spectral shroud resembling a figure from an old silent film, and the rhythmic, metallic clamor of the cable cars serves as the city's tireless, urgent pulse. Certain restaurants transcend mere commerce. They are entrenched institutions, sanctified temples of haute cuisine where unimaginable sums are exchanged, and personal legacies are either cemented or utterly destroyed. At the apex of this rarefied strata rests the Azure Point, an establishment so fiercely exclusive it requires no pedestrian placard, identified only by a discreet, flawlessly polished brass seahorse affixed to a massive, dark oak entrance. Inside, the atmosphere is not merely busy. It thrums with the quiet, sustained vibration of concentrated power, underscored by the gentle chime of barat crystal and the low, careful exchange of secrets traded over plates of painstaking, Michelin-starred artistry. For Clara Thompson, a woman whose professional standing had recently been downsized from a promising trajectory as a historical archivist to the stiff, humbling confines of a waitress's uniform, the air at the Azure Point held the distinct, cloying flavor of gilded desperation. Just 3 months prior, she had been enveloped by the soothing, familiar aroma of antique paper and aged leather bindings, painstakingly organizing the personal correspondence of a Gilded Age railroad tycoon for the city's venerable historical society. Then, a sudden corporate restructuring coupled with a brutal budget cut had ejected her and her profound reverence for the past onto the unyielding, anonymous streets of the present. Now, she was forced to absorb an entirely new canon of rules, a dizzying, intricate choreography of service where a water glass was required to be filled to an exact 1 inch from the rim, and a single misplaced salad fork constituted a cardinal, unforgivable transgression. The most vital regulation, however, was nowhere to be found in the neatly printed employee manual. It was transmitted in a hushed, almost ritualistic tone by an aged bartender named Arthur, a man whose weary, knowing eyes appeared to have witnessed the entire chronicle of human folly. "See that table?" he'd said on her inaugural shift, tilting his chin toward a secluded corner booth that offered a dramatic, panoramic sweep of the bay. "That's the Lion's Den, and the lioness arrives every Thursday." The lioness was Victoria Sterling, the only scion of the real estate magnate Alistair Sterling, a man who boasted of having carved his colossal empire directly from the city's geological bedrock. Victoria, however, projected a subtly different species of aristocracy. She was a fixture of the social scene, a dedicated and highly visible philanthropist, a permanent installment in the society columns, but to the anxious personnel of the Azure Point, she was a barely contained atmospheric disturbance, a quiet, predictable storm of calculated terror. Her malice was wielded like a specialized surgical instrument, delivered with a chillingly composed smile and an unwavering, icy gaze. Clara had absorbed the apocryphal tales. The young busboy, barely old enough to vote, dismissed instantaneously because his shadow had dared to briefly cross the periphery of her dinner plate. The sommelier, a man possessing 4 decades of wine expertise, reduced to a visibly trembling wreck after she had dismissed his carefully selected vintage as hopelessly pedestrian. Victoria Sterling did not merely take a meal at the Azure Point. She held court, and her terrified subjects were the staff who moved around her with the hyper-cautious, methodical grace of bomb disposal experts. This narrative is not simply about a straightforward conflict of personalities. It is the story of the slow, inevitable dismantling of a meticulously constructed facade, the sudden realization that even the most formidable personal fortresses are invariably erected upon shifting foundations of sand. It is an account of how a quiet woman, armed with nothing but a profound reverence for historical accuracy, deployed the truth itself as a weapon against a rival who had spent a lifetime trying to permanently inter her own past. And the entire skirmish was ignited by a single, perfectly temperature-controlled glass of water. A week into her new existence, Clara found herself nominated for the Lion's Den. The regular server assigned to Victoria's table had inconveniently been struck down by a case of the flu so sudden it felt suspiciously timely. The manager, a perpetually overwrought and slickly sweating man named Mr. Dubois, stared at Clara with the wide-eyed desperation of a priest selecting a sacrificial offering. "Thompson," he'd managed, his voice pinched high with anxiety. "You're calm. You're precise. You're covering table 7 tonight. Clara dedicated the next 60 minutes to preparing for the inevitable encounter with the intense focus of a historian synthesizing research for a critical dissertation defense. She committed Victoria's extensive preferences to memory. Still water, imported exclusively from a particular Norwegian glacial spring, must be maintained at exactly 42 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by a single paper-thin slice of cucumber, never, under any circumstances, lemon. The bread basket was permitted to contain only miniature pieces of brioche, warmed for precisely 20 seconds. Every minute detail was a potential landmine, primed to shatter the fragile professional détente. When Victoria Sterling eventually made her entrance, a palpable hush descended over the dining room. She was the embodiment of cold, precise, and highly expensive perfection. Her hair, the deep color of a raven's wing, was sculpted into a severely elegant chignon, and her gown, the hue of a tempestuous sea, clung flawlessly to her slender physique. Her eyes, a startling shade of cultivated violet, performed a comprehensive, bored appraisal of the entire room, conveying an air of unchallenged ownership. She did not so much walk to her designated table as she glided, a dominant, predatory swan moving effortlessly through a population of lesser beings. Clara approached the table, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm against her ribs. "Good evening, Miss Sterling. My name is Clara May, and I will be attending to your table this evening." Victoria's gaze flickered over her, a single, swift, dismissive appraisal that lasted less than a second. She did not deign to reply, merely issuing a languid, imperious gesture toward her empty water goblet. Clara, entirely prepared, poured the imported Norwegian water with a steady, practiced hand. She was just raising the silver tongs holding the requisite cucumber slice over the rim when Victoria's voice, soft as the finest silk yet sharp as a new razor, sliced through the subdued dining noise. "Stop!" Clara instantly froze, the silver tongs hovering motionless above the water. "What exactly do you imagine you are doing?" Victoria inquired, her tone dangerously low and measured. "I was merely adding the cucumber, Miss Sterling." "Did I ask for cucumber?" Clara was absolutely certain she had. The instruction was embedded in the client file, a preference noted conspicuously in bold red ink. "My sincerest apologies, Miss Sterling. The file clearly indicates." "I don't care what the file indicates," Victoria interrupted, her violet eyes narrowing to slits. "I am informing you now that I refuse to have a vegetable swimming in my water." "Is that really so profoundly difficult to comprehend?" The neighboring tables fell instantly silent, their high society occupants anticipating the commencement of one of Victoria's infamous public vivisections. Mr. Du Bois, radiating panic, began to shuffle over, his face contorted in a mask of anticipatory, pained apology. But Clara did not panic. She did not attempt to grovel. Her many years as an historical archivist had ingrained in her a meticulous adherence to detail and an absolute, non-negotiable trust in her own research. She regarded Victoria not through a lens of fear, but with a quiet, analytical curiosity. Victoria was not merely being capriciously difficult. She was setting a calculated test, springing a trap designed to expose weakness. "Of course, Miss Sterling," Clara replied, her voice maintaining a perfect equilibrium of professional deference and utterly unshakable calm. "My apologies for the misunderstanding. I will immediately bring you a new, fresh glass." She removed the glass and returned mere moments later with a new one filled with the identical, perfectly chilled water, sans the cucumber. Victoria observed her every minute movement, a faint flicker of annoyance visible in her violet eyes. She had been expecting a flustered, trembling, tearful apology from a subservient waitress. She had decidedly not anticipated this quiet, unflappable composure. Interacting with Clara was like striking a match against a cold, hard granite wall. There was no satisfying friction, no expected spark, no gratifying flare of sudden fear. The remainder of the service unfolded as a tense, silent ballet. Victoria communicated exclusively through clipped gestures and monosyllabic commands, but Clara moved with a practiced, almost unnerving serenity. She anticipated Victoria's every latent need, Her performance was flawless and mute. She was not functioning merely as a waitress. She was, in her mind, a student of history observing a rare historical artifact in its native habitat. A predator whose dominance derived not from intrinsic power, but exclusively from the instilled fear of everyone around her. And Clara, much to her own deep surprise, wasn't afraid. She was utterly fascinated. As Victoria was leaving, she paused abruptly beside Clara. "You're new here," she stated, her voice a low, warning purr. "Yes, Miss Sterling. Don't get comfortable." The words constituted a clear, unambiguous threat. But as Clara watched the real estate billionaire's daughter sweep commandingly out of the restaurant and into the San Francisco night, she experienced not a chill of fear, but the sharp, exhilarating spark of an old, familiar instinct. The archivist deep within her, the woman whose greatest joy lay in excavating the dusty, deliberately forgotten corners of the past, had just been handed a new, supremely compelling puzzle. Victoria Sterling maintained a beautifully, rigidly curated present. But Clara intuitively suspected that her past was a divergent story entirely. A story that was merely waiting for the right person to unearth it. The initial antagonistic encounter with Victoria Sterling ignited a fierce, intellectual fire in Clara. It was not fueled by vengeance or spite. It was driven by the desire to map and understand the precise anatomy of a psychological bully. Her former mentor at the Historical Society had a favored maxim. The more perfect the facade, the more fundamentally fractured the foundation beneath it. Clara decided it was high time she started doing some structural digging. Her investigation commenced not in the usual digital domain, but in the whispered, living archives of the Azure Point itself. The restaurant staff, she realized, constituted a vibrant, terrified library chronicling Victoria's long reign of terror. In the cramped, windowless break room, huddled over cups of lukewarm, oxidized coffee and trays of rapidly staling pastries, Clara listened. Remember the time she sent back a perfectly good bottle of Petrus because she claimed the cork had an arrogant squeak? A veteran waiter recalled, scrubbing at a resistant stain on his uniform. Or when she insisted the chef remake her risotto because the grains were not aligned in a soothing and symmetrical manner. Another added with a weary sigh. These were anecdotes of petty, theatrical tyranny, yet Clara was diligently searching for the underlying pattern. The common thread was Victoria's desperate, almost manic obsession with a very specific, almost theatrical performance of old-money elegance and established propriety. Any deviation from her meticulously crafted script was met with a disproportionate, almost frantic rage. This pattern suggested not the relaxed, innate confidence of a woman born to limitless wealth, but rather the intense, consuming anxiety of an imposter constantly terrified of immediate exposure. Arthur, the laconic bartender, quickly became her most invaluable source. One relentlessly rainy Tuesday evening, as the main restaurant floor settled into a quiet, subdued energy, Clara leaned casually against the mahogany bar. "You've been here a lifetime, Arthur. What was she truly like when she first started dining here?" Arthur paused his meticulous task, polishing a tall glass until the crystal gleamed with a blinding luster. Different. She was trying desperately to be the same, but the seams were showing, badly. This was maybe 15 years ago, right after her father, Alistair, landed his first confirmed billion. She was eager, far too eager, always watching everyone else, what they chose to wear, exactly how they managed to hold their forks. She wasn't dining. She was strenuously learning a demanding role. He leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "The really strange thing is this. Before Alistair Sterling became a household name echoing through the city, there was no Victoria Sterling. Not a single trace in the society pages, not anywhere." Clara's finely tuned archival instincts flared to life. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "I mean, the day Alistair Sterling officially hit the Forbes list, Victoria materialized instantly on his arm, a fully formed socialite complete with a vague, instantly accepted backstory about a prestigious Swiss boarding school and a quiet, privileged upbringing. I've served every established old-money family in this city for 30 years. I had never, not once, heard of her. A woman with absolutely no traceable past. That wasn't just a minor crack in the facade. It was a foundational, missing cornerstone. That night, Clara returned to her small, comforting, book-filled apartment. She fired up her laptop, her fingers moving across the keyboard with a familiar, professional rhythm. She commenced with the predictable basics: public records. A generalized search for Victoria Sterling coupled with an estimated birth year yielded the expected results. Glossy charity galas, high-fashion shows, flattering, glowing profiles in luxury lifestyle magazines. It was a digital smoke screen, a perfectly constructed, distracting narrative. She immediately shifted her tactics. She began searching for Alistair Sterling, deliberately focusing on news archives predating his colossal rise to prominence. He was known as a ruthless, highly ambitious developer, but his earliest years were shrouded in a surprising amount of impenetrable obscurity. He had seemingly appeared on the high-stakes San Francisco scene ex nihilo, a man with the undisputed Midas touch and an utterly mysterious origin. Clara started digging into ancient property records, defunct business filings, anything that might shed even a faint light on Alistair's initial origins. For several exhaustive days, she slammed into nothing but irritating dead ends. And then she located it, tucked away deep within the digital archives of a tiny, forgotten local newspaper originating from a dusty, economically depressed town deep in the Nevada desert was a brief, unremarkable article from the late 1980s detailing a contentious local zoning dispute. A small, family-owned diner was being forcibly purchased and shuttered to make way for a new, generic development project. The developer's name listed was Alistair Sterling. The article itself was mundane except for one small, critical detail. It parenthetically mentioned Alistair's family. His wife, who had tragically passed away several years earlier, and his young daughter. The daughter's name was emphatically not Victoria. It was Chastity. Chastity Sterling. Clara felt a profound jolt of adrenaline, the intensely familiar thrill of an archivist standing at the precipice of a monumental breakthrough. She immediately initiated a new search, this time for Chastity Sterling, and the sparse results that appeared began to paint a dramatically different picture. A handful of fleeting mentions in the local Nevada paper, an appearance on the high school honor roll, a victory in a county fair pie-eating contest, and then the digital Rosetta Stone. It was a functional link to a grainy, low-quality video hosted on a forgotten video-sharing platform. The footage was sourced from a local access cable channel in Nevada, a fuzzy broadcast of a small-town beauty pageant from the early 1990s. The pageant's corny theme was Silver State Sweethearts. Clara's hands were trembling slightly as she clicked the play icon. And there she was, a much younger, significantly less polished version of Victoria Sterling. Her hair was a brassy, over-processed blonde, a stark contrast to the sophisticated raven black she wore now. She was clad in a cheap, ill-fitting sequin gown and wore a strained, desperately forced smile. But the underlying bone structure was identical. The sharp jawline, the prominent high cheekbones, and the eyes. Not the cultivated violet of Victoria, but a pale, hard blue, filled with a raw, fierce, almost desperate ambition. The announcer's voice, tinny and distorted, boomed through the laptop speakers. And now giving us her stunning rendition of God Bless America is contestant number 7, the lovely Chastity Sterling. The girl on the screen opened her mouth, and a reedy, profoundly off-key voice wailed into the air. But it was not the singing that caused Clara's breath to catch. It was the interview portion that followed. So, Chastity, the host beamed. What do you dream of being when you finally grow up? The young woman's expression hardened immediately, her forced smile tightening into a grimace. I'm going to be rich, she stated, her voice a flat, nasal, hard drawl, worlds away from the clipped, vaguely European accent Victoria employed now. Richer than all of you combined. And I am going to get out of this miserable town, and I am absolutely never, ever coming back. Clara leaned back slowly in her chair, a grim, knowing smile spreading across her face. The lioness of the Azure Point, the unchallenged queen of San Francisco society, had a verifiable skeleton rattling in her meticulously organized closet. And that skeleton was a small-town beauty queen named Chastity with a terrible singing voice and a heart absolutely saturated with furious rage. The carefully constructed world of Victoria Sterling was a monstrous, multi-million-dollar fabrication. A monumental effort designed to permanently bury the ghost of Chastity. The hushed whispers in the restaurant were irrelevant now. Clara had just found the name. The original name that Victoria Sterling had tried to obliterate forever. The discovery of Chastity Sterling fundamentally altered everything for Clara. But she was keenly aware that this knowledge was a volatile weapon that had to be deployed with absolute precision. A direct, impulsive confrontation would be the act of a fool. For the time being, she would guard the secret carefully, a hidden ace tucked securely into the starch-stiff pocket of her uniform. Her continued, professional composure, however, was having a profoundly unnerving effect on Victoria. Clara's absolute refusal to be emotionally baited acted as a constant, low-grade irritant, an unforgiving grain of sand in the perfectly oiled mechanism of Victoria's dominance. If Victoria could not break the new waitress using psychological warfare, she would have no choice but to escalate. She would have to engineer her utter destruction. The attack materialized on a warm, balmy Saturday evening when the Azure Point was operating at its glittery, chaotic zenith. Victoria was at her customary table, holding court with a group of equally wealthy and immensely influential friends. She presented a faultless picture of effortless charm and gracious composure. But Clara, now expertly attuned to the subtle tells, could detect the intense tension around Victoria's jawline. The way her violet eyes kept flicking toward Clara, tracking her movements. She was a sleek panther waiting patiently in the tall grass, anticipating the ideal moment to pounce. The moment arrived just after the main course plates had been efficiently cleared. Victoria emitted a small, perfectly timed gasp, bringing one manicured hand to her throat, her diamond-encrusted fingers fluttering dramatically against her skin. "Oh my goodness, darling," she cried out, her voice a carefully calibrated mix of shock and near panic. "It's gone." Her friends instantly turned to her, their faces etched with concern. "What is gone, darling?" asked one of them, a woman named Beatrice, leaning in conspiratorially. "My necklace!" Victoria exclaimed, her voice swelling just enough to carry clearly above the dining room's refined ambient hum. "The sterling sapphire. My father presented it to me for my 30th birthday. It's vanished." A distinct wave of hushed whispers spread outward from their table. The sterling sapphire was a truly legendary piece of jewelry, a massive, flawless cornflower blue gem rumored to be valued at more than an entire fleet of luxury automobiles. Victoria propelled herself out of her seat, her face molded into a mask of frantic disbelief. "It was right here just moments ago. I specifically remember fidgeting with it just before the waitress cleared my plate." Her eyes, cold and sharp as shards of ice, abruptly locked onto Clara. "You, the waitress. You were the last person near this table. You leaned directly over me when you took my friend's plate." The accusation, as devastating as it was entirely predictable, hung heavy in the opulent air. Clara felt a sudden, cold dread wash over her, but her intensive archival training, the discipline of remaining meticulously calm and analytical in the face of sudden chaos, immediately took over her nervous system. Stay calm. Observe. Do not react. "Miss Sterling," Clara began, her voice steady despite the frantic, powerful drumming in her chest. "I assure you, I did not see any necklace." "Of course, you would say that," Beatrice chimed in immediately, eager to play her assigned role in the unfolding drama. "It could have simply fallen onto the plate, and you just whisked it away with the food scraps." Mr. Dubois frantically rushed over, his face sickly pale and slick with panicked sweat. "Miss Sterling, what appears to be the trouble?" "The trouble," Dubois, Victoria said, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Clara, "is that my necklace, a piece of jewelry easily worth a small fortune, has utterly vanished, and your waitress here was the last possible person near me. I demand that she be searched. I demand that the entire kitchen be searched. I want that necklace located immediately." This was the intended checkmate, a public theatrical branding. In this insular, rarefied world, The unchallenged word of Victoria Sterling against that of a disposable waitress was an open and shut case. Clara would be instantly fired. Her professional reputation would be permanently shattered. The formal accusation of theft, even if ultimately unproven, would be a permanent, career-ending stain. Mr. Dubois looked desperately at Clara, his eyes conveying a pathetic mixture of pity and frantic pleading. "Clara May, did you genuinely see anything at all?" "No, sir," Clara said firmly. "I cleared the plates and took them directly and immediately to the kitchen dish station." "Search her pockets," Beatrice demanded sharply. "That won't be necessary," Clara said, her voice cutting decisively through the rising tide of public hysteria. She looked Mr. Dubois directly in the eye. "I will quite happily empty my pockets right now. I have absolutely nothing to conceal." She calmly retrieved her server's notepad, a pen, and a small tube of hand lotion, placing them neatly on a nearby service stand for everyone to witness. Victoria scoffed dramatically. "As if you would keep a massive sapphire in your uniform pocket. It's likely hidden deep in the kitchen, stashed in a bin, waiting for you to sneakily retrieve it at the end of your shift." The trap was as intellectually brilliant as it was emotionally cruel. The necklace was almost certainly nestled safely in the silk lining of Victoria's own expensive clutch, intended to be discovered later, long after Clara's professional life had been thoroughly and irrevocably ruined. An accusation was all that was truly required. "We will, naturally, search the kitchen thoroughly," Mr. Dubois stammered, attempting to appease her. "And what about her?" Victoria insisted, her voice rising to a shrill, demanding theatrical pitch. "She should be detained. We must summon the police immediately." The staff commenced a frantic, humiliating search, dropping to their hands and knees to peer beneath tables. Clara remained perfectly still, the silent, falsely accused eye of the manufactured hurricane. She knew she was being framed. She knew that desperate denials were futile and that evidence of her innocence concerning the necklace was impossible to produce because the necklace's location was itself part of the calculated lie. She had to instantly change the narrative. She had to deploy the single weapon Victoria had no idea she possessed: knowledge. This was the critical moment. Not to drop the entire nuclear bomb, but to plant a potent, debilitating seed of doubt. To introduce a powerful element of chaotic uncertainty into Victoria's perfectly staged drama. As the fruitless, agonizing search continued, a heavy, suffocating sense of doom began to settle over Clara. Mr. Dubois was frantically wringing his hands. Victoria was looking supremely triumphant. "We can't seem to find anything, Miss Sterling," Mr. Dubois reported, his voice shaky and defeated. "Then call the police," Victoria commanded. "I want to file an official report immediately." The word report hung ominously in the air. A final, damning verdict. Clara knew this was her absolute last chance. She couldn't disprove her guilt regarding the physical necklace, but she could fatally attack the credibility of her vicious accuser. She drew a deep, centering breath and looked directly into Victoria's violet eyes. Her voice was not raised, but it was crystal clear, and it carried an unexpected, weighty resonance. "Miss Sterling, perhaps you should check your clutch again. Sometimes when people are under extreme stress, we tend to misplace or overlook things." Victoria laughed, a short, ugly sound entirely devoid of mirth. "Are you actually suggesting I'm suffering from forgetfulness?" "I think not." "Not at all," Clara countered, her tone remaining perfectly level. "It's simply that high-stress situations can be profoundly disorienting. They can make you feel momentarily disconnected, like you're suddenly operating in a different time, a different place." She paused for a beat, letting the words hang in the air, weighted and heavy. "A place with a lot of dust and silver state pageants, for instance." The words dropped into the highly charged, toxic atmosphere of the restaurant with the blunt, shocking force of a physical blow. They were so acutely specific, so utterly foreign to the gilded world Victoria inhabited, that they created a moment of pure, unadulterated confusion for every observer. Victoria's sleek, moneyed friends exchanged puzzled glances. Mr. Dubois drew his brows together in a deep frown, utterly lost. But Victoria froze completely. For a critical fraction of a second, the mask, the elegant, flawlessly constructed facade of the wrong socialite, slipped entirely. A flicker of raw, primal, animal fear flashed in her violet eyes. It was the naked look of a cornered beast realizing the hunter knew its scent. Her face, which moments earlier had been flushed with theatrical, righteous anger, turned a deathly, ghastly pale. What did you say? She stammered, her voice suddenly high and thin, losing every trace of its imperious, cultivated edge. Clara held her gaze steadily, her expression a perfect, impenetrable blank slate. I merely said that things can be disorienting, she repeated softly, her tone reasonable. My deepest apologies if I misspoke. But the calculated damage was done. The surgical strike had hit its intended, unseen mark. Clara hadn't accused her of anything remotely actionable. She had simply painted a tiny, vivid, dusty picture. A picture that meant absolutely nothing to anyone else in the room, a meaningless string of words, but which meant everything to Victoria. It was a clear, devastating signal, a quiet, horrifying whisper that carried the weight of a scream. I know. The shift in Victoria's demeanor was instantaneous and palpable. Her rock-solid confidence wavered, visibly shaking the air around her. The righteous fury that had been her impenetrable shield now seemed brittle, paper-thin, ready to shatter. She had lost control of the narrative entirely. Sensing his friend's sudden, profound distress, a panic that seemed disproportionate to the insult, one of the men at the table pushed his chair back and stood up abruptly. All right, Victoria. This has gone on long enough. Let's just go. We'll deal with the insurance company for the necklace tomorrow. No, Victoria said, but her voice now lacked its earlier, commanding conviction. She was rattled, her mind clearly racing, struggling to comprehend how this waitress, this non-entity, this nobody, could possibly know anything about Silver State pageants and dust. It was then that Clara played her final, brilliant card. It was a magnificent gamble, a piece of quiet psychological theater based on a hunch about human nature and the towering vanity of a woman like Victoria. Miss Sterling, Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly calm, measured and reasonable. Before you go and involve the police, perhaps you might check the small silk-lined pocket on the inside of your wrap. Sometimes a clasp can come undone, and a heavy pendant can slip into an unexpected place, especially after a great deal of commotion. Victoria shot Clara a look of pure, concentrated venom. She understood the maneuver instantly. Clara was offering her an out, an escape route from the humiliation, but an escape route that would make her look utterly, laughably, and irrevocably foolish. It was a checkmate delivered with a smile. If the necklace were to be found on her person, the entire elaborate scene she had created, the accusation, the outrage, the demand for investigation, would collapse instantly into a ridiculous, hysterical farce. Hesitantly, Beatrice, her primary friend and co-conspirator, reached for Victoria's heavy, impeccably draped cashmere wrap, which rested over the back of her chair. Well, it's worth a look, I suppose, she muttered, her voice thick with doubt and embarrassment. Beatrice's manicured fingers fumbled nervously with the soft fabric of the wrap, and then her expression shifted from confusion to a stark, dawning surprise. Her fingers closed around a small, hard, familiar object nestled deep within the lining. She pulled it out. There, glittering malevolently under the soft, bespoke lighting of the azure point, was the sterling sapphire, its deep, captured blue catching the light like a magnificent piece of the twilight sky momentarily frozen in stone. A collective, audible gasp went through the room, a wave of shock and disbelief. Well, I'll be damned, Beatrice muttered, staring at the necklace, then back at the interior of the wrap. It must have come unclasped and fallen right into the lining. All this fuss, Victoria? She said, looking pointedly at her friend, a hint of sharp annoyance now coloring her tone. And it was here the entire time. The humiliation was instantaneous, comprehensive, and absolute. Victoria's face went from deathly pale to a deep, blotchy, mottled red, the color of true mortification. She had accused a low-paid waitress of grand theft, demanded a full police investigation, and held the entire elite restaurant hostage, only for the missing item to be discovered nestled securely in her own designer cashmere wrap. She no longer looked like a powerful, wronged victim. She looked like a fool. A hysterical, paranoid, privileged woman who had misplaced her own jewelry and thrown a spectacularly childish, entitled tantrum. Her friends, desperate to avoid eye contact, suddenly found the delicate floral patterns etched onto their expensive plates intensely fascinating. The whispers sweeping through the room were no longer about the audacity of theft, but the sheer, delightful absurdity of ridicule. Without another word, her dignity completely shredded, Victoria snatched the sapphire from Beatrice's hand, grabbed her small, jeweled clutch and stormed out of the Azure Point. Her head was held high in a final, defiant gesture, but her entire posture, the stiffness of her back, the rapidity of her stride screamed of utter defeat. Her friends were left behind, their faces fixed in masks of weary, apologetic misery, to settle the bill and deal with the ruinous crater of social embarrassment Victoria had left in her wake. Mr. Du Bois looked across the room at Clara, his expression a chaotic mixture of awe and stark terror. He didn't understand what had just transpired. Not really. But he knew, in his gut, that Clara had somehow faced down the queen in her own den, and against all conceivable odds, she had won a decisive victory. Clara took a slow, steadying breath, her high-speed adrenaline slowly beginning its inevitable retreat. She hadn't needed to expose Chastity Sterling yet. She had simply used a few carefully chosen, context-specific words to unravel the threat of Victoria's composure, making her look not merely cruel, but utterly, laughably ridiculous. And in Victoria Sterling's rigidly defined, status-obsessed world, being ridiculous was a fate far, far worse than being feared. The immediate fallout from the necklace incident was profound and seismic. Overnight, the atmosphere among the staff at the Azure Point shifted completely. The waiters and busboys no longer looked at Clara with pity or mild curiosity, but with a kind of bewildered, fiercely protective reverence. She was the quiet woman who had successfully made the self-crowned queen look like a court jester. The fear of Victoria Sterling had not vanished entirely, but it was now laced with a delicious, liberating element of shared mockery. Predictably, Victoria Sterling did not return the following Thursday, nor the Thursday after that. Her absence was a palpable relief, the collective lifting of a long, oppressive siege that had weighed on the staff for months. But Clara, the keen analyst, knew instinctively that it wasn't over. A woman whose identity was built entirely on control and reputation didn't simply accept this level of public humiliation. Victoria would be plotting her revenge, something far more permanent and destructively targeted than a public tantrum. Clara knew she had to arm herself immediately for the final confrontation. It was time to fully resurrect the buried ghost of Chastity Sterling. Her first critical step was to find a primary source, someone who knew Chastity before she had successfully buried herself under layers of sterling wealth and a new, forged identity. The small-town Nevada newspaper archives were a start, but they provided only cold, impersonal records. Clara needed a human connection, a voice from the past. She found a promising lead in a high school yearbook she'd managed to access through an obscure online genealogy database. Under Chastity Sterling's senior picture, there was a list of extracurricular activities, including the Future Homemakers of America Club. The club's faculty advisor was a woman named Eleanor Vance. A quick, targeted search revealed that Eleanor Vance, now in her late 60s, was still living in the same small Nevada town, retired after a 40-year career as a beloved home economics teacher. It was a long shot, traversing half the country for a mere name. But Clara composed a carefully worded email, introducing herself as a freelance writer working on a long-form story about the changing face of the American West, and how the lives of ambitious young women in small towns had evolved over the past few decades. She mentioned that she'd serendipitously come across Chastity Sterling's name in her research and would be deeply grateful to hear any faint memories Mrs. Vance might have of a former student. For 2 tense days, there was only silence. Clara began to resign herself to a dead end, convinced the email had been relegated to a spam folder. Then, An email notification popped up, its subject line crisp and professional. It was from Eleanor Vance. "Dear Miss Thompson," the email began. "I remember Chastity Sterling very well. A very ambitious, driven young woman. If you are ever in our neck of the woods, I would be happy to chat over a cup of tea." 2 days later, Clara was driving her aging, beat-up sedan through the vast, shimmering empty expanse of the Nevada desert, the blinding heat a stark world away from the cool, foggy, controlled streets of San Francisco. She found Eleanor Vance in a small, meticulously tidy house with a modest but resilient garden full of hardy desert roses. Over glasses of sweet iced tea and buttery, homemade shortbread cookies, Eleanor painted a vivid and often poignant picture of the girl who would become Victoria Sterling. "Chastity was always a girl in a terrible hurry," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with a sad, gentle wisdom that comes from decades of observation. Her mother had passed away when she was young, and her father, Alistair, was always working, always scheming. He was a hard, ruthless man, obsessed with making money, consumed with escaping his own humble, blue-collar beginnings. And he poured all of that ambition, all of that fundamental shame, directly into his daughter. Eleanor described a young girl who was relentlessly drilled on formal etiquette, who was forced into rigorous voice and deportment lessons, who was constantly told by her father that her small-town roots were something to be ashamed of, something that must be forcibly erased. She was fiercely ambitious. Yes, Eleanor continued, stirring her tea. But she was also deeply, profoundly insecure. She truly believed that the only way to be loved, the only way to be safe, was to be perfect, to be powerful, to be someone else entirely. The beauty pageants, the desperate attempts at instant sophistication, it was all part of Alistair's grand, monstrous plan to mold his daughter into a suitable accessory for the empire he was determined to build. "Is there anything else?" Clara asked quietly, sensing the pause, sensing there was a darker, specific core to the story. Any specific event she would be terrified of people knowing? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant, fixed on the desert roses outside the window. "There is one thing," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her senior year there was a minor scandal. A boy in her class, a sweet, painfully shy kid from a very poor farm family, had a crush on her. He wrote her a poem. It was clumsy, perhaps, but profoundly heartfelt. To Chastity, however, it was a humiliating reminder of the commonness she was so desperate to escape. She didn't just reject him, she destroyed him. She read the poem aloud in the crowded school hallway, mocking every single, heartfelt word. The boy was utterly devastated. He dropped out of school a week later. Eleanor sighed, a deep, weary sound that echoed decades of silent regret. But that's not the worst of it. The boy's family owned a small plot of land, nothing agriculturally special, but it stood directly in the way of a major development project Alistair wanted to initiate. A month after the incident with the poem, there was a fire. The family's barn burned down to the ground. The official cause was listed as faulty wiring, but there were rumors, ugly rumors, whispered through the town. The family, broken and defeated, sold their land to Alistair for a fraction of its worth and simply left town forever. "Nothing was ever proven, of course," Eleanor said, her voice dropping lower, conspiratorial. "But Chastity, she knew. I saw it in her eyes that week. She knew her petty cruelty had paved the way for her father's massive greed. It was the first, and perhaps the last time I ever saw a flicker of genuine, self-aware fear in that girl's eyes. A fire, a ruined family, a terrible secret buried under years of compounded wealth and a fabricated new name. This was much more than a skeleton in the closet. This was a fully formed ghost. A ghost that possessed the undeniable power to burn Victoria Sterling's carefully constructed world right down to the scorched earth." Clara thanked Eleanor, her mind racing with the strategic implications of the confession. She now understood the dark core of Victoria's being. Her habitual cruelty wasn't just about exercising power. It was a desperate, ongoing effort to outrun the ghost of her past, to silence the constant, nagging whisper of shame that had been her companion since that fateful, arrogant day in a high school hallway. Clara knew Victoria would be back. Her massive ego, her pride, and her desperate need for control would demand that she returned to the scene of her humiliation to reassert her dominance. She would come back to destroy the waitress who had dared to see behind the curtain. But when she did, Clara would be ready. She wouldn't be fighting Victoria Sterling, the untouchable billionaire's daughter. She would be waiting for Chastity Sterling, the terrified girl with a terrible, burning secret, and Clara was holding the match. 3 weeks after the necklace debacle, Victoria Sterling returned to the Azure Point. It was a Thursday night, and a palpable wave of suffocating tension rolled through the dining room the moment she swept through the large oak doors. This time, significantly, she was alone. She was dressed not in her usual opulent evening wear, but in a severe, sharp black pantsuit, looking as if she were formally dressed for battle or execution. She didn't wait to be seated by the horrified host. She walked directly to her usual table, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Clara at her service station. She crooked a single, imperious finger, a silent, unmistakable summons. Mr. Du Bois rushed forward, intending to intervene and protect his employee, but Clara gave him a subtle, decisive shake of her head. This was inevitable. This was the final act, playing out just as she had anticipated. She smoothed her crisp apron and walked toward the table, her heart beating a steady, determined, and entirely unafraid rhythm. "Good evening, Miss Sterling," Clara said, her voice perfectly neutral, professional. Victoria didn't return the greeting. She merely gestured sharply to the empty chair opposite her. "Sit." It was a flagrant, unforgivable breach of protocol, a deliberate and aggressive power move designed to establish immediate dominance. "I'm on duty, Miss Sterling." "Sit," she repeated, her voice low, chilling, and menacing, "or I will buy this entire restaurant by morning and have it summarily torn down to the foundation. Your choice." Clara pulled out the chair and sat down slowly, her back ramrod straight, projecting calm strength. The other diners, sensing the bizarre, frozen intensity of the moment, watched, mystified by the strange, unfolding scene. "I don't know what kind of pathetic game you think you're playing," Victoria began, leaning forward across the pristine white linen, her violet eyes burning with a cold, focused fire. "I don't know how you found out what you think you know. I assume you dug up some piece of meaningless dirt, and now you're planning some clumsy, desperate blackmail attempt. It was a catastrophic mistake." "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara said calmly, maintaining her poker face. "Don't you dare lie to me," Victoria hissed, her hard-won composure finally cracking under the pressure. "You think you're clever. You think you embarrassed me with that ridiculous stunt. Let me tell you exactly what's going to happen now. I have had my father's legal team run a complete, exhaustive background check on you, Clara May Thompson. I know all about your failed career as a dust-sifting archivist. I know about your crippling student loans. I know all about the tiny, pathetic apartment you can barely afford in a bad neighborhood." She leaned back in her chair, a cruel, satisfied smirk twisting her lips. "You are a nobody. By the time I am finished with you, you won't even be able to get a job washing dishes in a dive bar. I will personally call every potential employer you ever approach. I will tell them you are a thief, a blackmailer, an unstable, vindictive little insect. I will sue you for slander. I will bury you in legal fees until you are begging for mercy. I will destroy every corner of your miserable little life. Do you understand me?" Clara listened to the entire litany of extravagant threats without the slightest flinch. This was the dragon's fire, the final, desperate attempt to incinerate the threat before it could speak. But Clara wasn't afraid of the fire anymore, because she knew precisely what the dragon was made of: vanity and terror. She leaned forward slightly, subtly matching Victoria's aggressive posture. "You're right about one thing," Clara said, her voice soft, but carrying an unmistakable razor-sharp edge of steel. "I am an archivist, and I am very, very good at my job. I know you're not Victoria Sterling from a Swiss boarding school. I know you're Chastity Sterling from a dusty, forgotten town in Nevada. Victoria's jaw tightened visibly, but she tried desperately to hold her ground, her eyes flashing denial. Lies and slander. I know about the Silver State Sweethearts pageant, Clara continued, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible, devastating level. And I know about a boy who wrote you a poem. A sweet boy whose family lost everything in a terrible fire right after you humiliated him. At the mention of the fire, the specific, unforgivable event, Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. The blood drained from her face, leaving her with a deathly, porous, waxen pallor. This was a direct, fatal hit. This wasn't a vague reference to an old pageant. This was the ghost, summoned from the deepest recesses of her past and seated right at the table with them. I know about the barn chastity, Clara said, the use of the old, despised name a deliberate, agonizing twist of the knife. I know about the rumors. I know about the broken family that was driven out of town so your father could build his empire on their ashes. Victoria stared at her, utterly speechless, paralyzed. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She looked not like a powerful billionaire's daughter, but like the terrified, vicious girl from the past, her worst nightmare incarnate. Here is exactly what's going to happen now, Clara said, taking complete, total command of the narrative. You are going to leave this restaurant. You are never going to come back. You are not going to harass, threaten, or even speak the name of any person on this staff ever again. You are going to leave me and everyone here entirely alone. If you fail to comply, if I hear so much as a whisper of you causing trouble for anyone, I will dedicate my entire life to uncovering the documented truth about that fire. I will find that family, and I will write their story. And I will make absolutely certain that every newspaper, every television station, every blog, and every glossy magazine in this country knows that the Sterling Empire was built on a foundation of casual cruelty, relentless greed, and a very convenient fire. Every word was a perfectly placed surgical blow. Clara laid out the terms of surrender, not of a service worker to a patron, but of one woman who possessed the devastating truth to another who was drowning in a lifetime of carefully constructed lies. For a long, agonizing silent moment, Victoria simply stared. The raw fear in her eyes slowly gave way to a look of utter, deep-seated, souled hatred. But she was defeated. She was completely and utterly checkmated. The ghost Clara had summoned was standing directly behind her, and it had its cold, unforgiving hands on her shoulders. Slowly, shakily, Victoria Sterling, or rather, Chastity Sterling, rose from the table. She didn't say a single word. She didn't look at anyone. With the last tattered shred of her former dignity, she turned and walked stiffly out of the Azure Point for the final time. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind her with a definitive thud, and it was as if a decades-long curse had been suddenly, miraculously lifted. A stunned, shocked silence filled the elegant dining room, followed instantaneously by a quiet, spontaneous, and profound burst of applause from the kitchen staff, who had gathered at the doorway, watching the entire exchange. Mr. Du Bois rushed over to Clara, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound respect. I don't know what to say. Clara finally let out the long, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She stood up, picked up the silver water pitcher from her service station, and adjusted the apron around her waist. "Don't worry, Mr. Du Bois," she said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time all night. "Table 4 needs more water." She was no longer just Clara May Thompson, the beleaguered waitress. She was the woman who had faced the lioness in her own luxurious den and sent her running, not with fire or fury, but with the quiet, undeniable, devastating power of the truth. And just like that, the reign of terror was over. The detailed story of what happened that night at the Azure Point immediately became a potent legend, whispered among the city's sophisticated service industry. A morale-boosting tale of how a quiet waitress with a spine of steel and a historian's mind had effectively toppled a tyrant. Clara didn't remain a waitress for long. Her actions, and the quiet dignity and startling intellect with which she carried them out, caught the serious attention of a wealthy patron, a retired history professor who had witnessed the final, dramatic confrontation. He admired her courage, her deep intellect, and her genuine passion for the past. He offered her a job funding and running a new, independent historical research foundation, allowing her to finally return to the work she truly loved, unearthing the forgotten vital stories of the city and its people. Victoria Sterling was never seen in that part of the city again. She became a ghost in her own gilded cage, forever haunted by a despised name she could no longer permanently bury. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true, enduring strength isn't derived from wealth or societal power, but from the courage to stand firm in the truth, no matter the consequences. It shows that bullies, no matter how formidable or expensively dressed, are often just terrified people hiding behind an incredibly fragile mask. And sometimes, all it takes is one quiet voice armed with a forgotten, devastating fact to bring the entire elaborate facade crumbling down. If this story resonated with your own sense of justice, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear about the quiet triumph of integrity, and subscribe for more stories about unexpected heroes and the enduring, quiet victory of truth.